How many times did you go to rehab? You said, is it 18 times?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
But it had to come from you. So what was rock bottom?
There wasn't one. It's all rock bottom. It all sucked.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear. Thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
If Rob Reiner's movies projected life and light onto a screen, what Nick did was the opposite. And a big way that Rob was able to make something of his life and Nick wasn't, was that Rob was able to differentiate himself from his father. And did you know that he had similar issues with his own father that Nick had with Rob, with his father? And so that's something that is quite strange, that Nick couldn't learn from the same lessons that his own father had to learn from his father. And I think that's quite an interesting question, is what were those lessons and why couldn't he learn them?
When did you, what made you finally make it not a 19th?
I was just sick of it. I mean, it's hard to believe that you wouldn't get sick after 5 of them, but I mean, after 18, I was like, okay, I'm pretty bored of this. It wasn't like I want to go back to rehab. I was like, I'm sick of this cycle.
In a fascinating article on NPR, Rob Reiner was asked about differentiating himself from his father with specifically a movie, that was how it started, Stand By Me in 1986. And he said, I never said specifically I want to be a film director. I never said that. And I never really thought that way. I just knew I wanted to act, direct, and do things, be in the world that he was in. Just look at those words. I just knew I wanted to do things. That, I think, is a big difference between Rob and his father and Nick and his father, because Nick didn't seem to want to do things. Nick didn't seem to want to do anything. And Nick didn't seem to know anything very certainly. I mean, even in this interview that he gives, you know, for example, when they asked, you know, what was rock bottom, he can't seem to give a concrete answer. It seems kind of wishy-washy.
It's using drugs, it being so temporary, the fix, then going back into a place for months on end, then getting out and just, you know, rinse, wash, repeat.
This being my life.
Yeah.
The other thing that Rob says is, I just knew I wanted to be in the world. And I think that's also the difference between Rob and his father, Rob and his father, and Nick and his father. And that is, if you think about it, a lot of what drug use is about not wanting to be in the world, wanting to escape the world, wanting to live in kind of a fantasy world, wanting to avoid the real world, wanting to run away, essentially, right? So this is really about someone wanting to run away from a world, and most people can't understand that. Like a lot of people that don't live in Brentwood and that don't have that sort of wealth and wealthy family and famous relatives will find it very hard to say, wow, that is a horrible life that you have, and I want to escape it. Because I think there are millions of people who would give up their lives for that life, and they'd certainly be willing to make sacrifices and work very hard just to be able to sort of enter that life. And yes, someone is born into that life, and that's somehow something that he can't handle, which, if you think about it, is kind of crazy.
You believe, and they'll tell you, you're gonna die if you continue on this way. Do you think you would die, or did you still feel invincible?
No, I mean, of course there's that level of feeling that way, but I was, you know, the rate I was going was probably not great.
And just think about how he expresses that. It was probably not great. That's like the understatement of the year. Probably not great. Well, it's not even, I don't even think you'd say not great. It was horrendous what he was doing. And I think if you look at when he was going to rehab, I think he went to 18 rehab stints until he was 22 years old. And so didn't he start when he was 14? 18 visits to rehab in 8 years is essentially 2.25 visits per year. That's quite a lot. It's also quite a lot of time just stubbornly continuing on, which is why one has the sense of him as a poor little rich boy, isn't it? And this is what Rob also said. He said, it wasn't until I did Stand By Me that I really started to feel very separate and apart from my father, because the first film I did was This Is Spinal Tap, which is a satire. My father had trafficked in satire with Sid Caesar for many years. And then the second film I did was a film called The Sure Thing, which was a romantic comedy for young people. And my father, Rob says, had done romantic comedy. The Dick Van Dyke Show is a romantic comedy, a series. But when I did Stand By Me, it was the one that was closest to me. So he found something that he felt really strongly about and something that he really identified with. And he made kind of a project out of this. And what Rob is referring to here is finding his own voice. And if you'll indulge me for a second, I can also speak to this in a sense. It's quite a long discussion if you really go into it, because a writer must also find his own voice, and it must be a voice that works as well. Artist has also got to find his own voice in a sense in terms of differentiating his art from other artists. And that's easier said than done. But if you'll indulge me for a second, I came from a family of artists. Or my great-grandfather is the most famous of them all. He's a Dutch artist. He was even invited by the Queen of the Netherlands to paint in a Dutch palace at one point. He also painted the portrait of a South African president, I believe, and he got a lot of press both in South Africa and the Netherlands with his exhibitions. He's regarded today as one of South Africa's most popular landscape artists, basically a master, a master landscape artist. And I suppose you could call him a Dutch master. His son Gabriel, my great uncle, also went on to become a well-known artist. And obviously their paintings are worth quite a lot of money. My aunt and my brother are also artists. And then when I was a kid, my brother and I both did art. And then at a certain point, as much as I love art, I still do, and I'm a natural artist as well, there was a point where I found it stifling and frustrating. We'd often have family coming over to visit, and we'd both show our art. It was kind of a competition. And then I kind of really found that the tedium, especially of the oil painting side of things, I found it very frustrating and expensive. And it was at that point that I started to make a point to differentiate myself, and I did that by writing. I felt that I could say what I wanted to say, and I had a lot to say through writing and to some extent through photography. So that was the first thing, a departure essentially in medium, but then it took quite a long time to find my voice in that particular medium. And we all need to find our voice. It doesn't need to be through art or writing or anything creative. It can be through a vocation or a sense of our identity or a sense of whatever your passion is or a calling. But I think there is something creative about creating yourself. I don't know if there's anything more creative than that, and forging your identity. And my sense is that Nick was simply too lazy to do this. Perhaps too spoiled and entitled, perhaps even intimidated as well. Perhaps he was sort of cowering from the enormity of the fame of his relatives. And I suppose you could argue, well, maybe your great-grandfather was a famous artist, but nowhere near he certainly wasn't world famous like Rob Reiner, and maybe that's a good point. But I still think the same thing is sound. You don't look outward to find a way to find your voice. You look inward, and if there's nothing there, well, keep looking, keep searching. And I don't think he didn't because he couldn't. I don't think he lacked the capacity. I think he didn't because he was lazy and had sort of gone over to the dark side by doing it so habitually, where he felt he could get what he wanted without making an effort. And I think that laziness became a habit as well. And bad habits die hard. And I think if you have been doing that for a really long time, you do wake up one day and you feel the hollowness and emptiness of that lifestyle of not making an effort and not not amounting to much, but not wanting to amount to much either. You don't want to study, you don't need to have a job, you don't want to have a job, and also probably the fact that he wakes up one day and finds that no one really respects him. And that's rightfully so, because he is basically a loser. People respect people who do something, where there's effort involved, where there's adversity involved. There's nothing like that when you just take drugs. That's the path of least resistance. I felt that my father didn't love me or understand me, and it was the character of Gordy that expressed those things. Those aren't Nick's words, they're Rob's. I felt that my father didn't love me. I felt that my father didn't understand me. And so you can imagine Rob wasn't completely unsympathetic to his son's plight. Why? Because he'd been in it himself. He had navigated that psychology himself. He'd extricated himself from it as well. So what Nick needed was a way to express himself. And unfortunately, he seemed to think taking drugs and being addicted was a way of expressing himself. And I suppose from a certain point of view, it is. If you ask me, it's an idiotic way. It's a fool's errand, and you can see where that errand has led him ultimately into darkness.
Please, Neo, you have to trust me.
Why?
Because you have been down there, Neo. You know that road. You know exactly where it ends. And I know that's not where you want to be.
In the movie The Matrix, in this scene, Neo closes the door and he listens to Trinity, and he doesn't go down that road. What do you think Nick does? Nick knew as well where that road would take him, because he'd gone down it so many times before. But instead, he gets out the vehicle and he goes on that road regardless. That is his decision. It's a bad decision, but it's his responsibility for making a series of bad decisions. Don't blame it on mental illness or schizophrenia. Base it on hedonism and hard-headedness and laziness. Back to the article. And the film was a combination of nostalgia, emotion, and a lot of humor. And it was a real reflection of my personality. A real reflection of my personality. That is something that Nick, I think, was looking for and wasn't able to find. Because I think in a way he didn't have a personality. It was an extension really of my sensibility. And when it became successful, I said, oh, okay, I can go in the direction that I want to go in and not feel like I have to mirror everything my father's done up until then. In other words, he felt like he didn't need to be beholden to his famous father in order to become something himself. He could stand alone. And I think Nick made the same decision, but with a very clear caveat. If Rob got high making movies, Nick just wanted to get high doing nothing. Think about those words. I can go in the direction that I want to go in and not feel like I have to mirror everything my father's done up until then. If Rob didn't want to mirror everything his father did, Nick thought he could get away mirroring nothing, doing nothing, being nothing, and coasting on the family name. That is hard to do at a party when your part of the family name holds no value. And I think at Conan's party, that was Nick's most authentic moment, when he fully realized what an absolute nobody he was. And then, of course, he took on that mantle fully, because though he is infamous now, when his parents died, he also killed off anything good about himself, anything worth telling feel-good stories about. In this sense, Nick wasn't the mirror of his father, but a gross distortion. If movies project life and light onto a screen, what Nick did was the opposite, project darkness and death. And ultimately, his darkness consumed him and them. Does that make sense? Well, I'm not going to take it further than that. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.